This is Assessment 3, Cultural Plunge. It is a reflection on cultural background and the impact it has on education. This presentation showcases my own personal reflection as I embark on a cultural plunge. I explore my own experiences of education and the experiences of someone from a different cultural background. In an attempt to understand our identity in relation to school, in this presentation I discuss the various aspects that are essential in creating an environment that allows students from all backgrounds to be successful in. Chura Sapkota is a 45-year-old Bhutanese refugee who is currently working as a residential care worker in Wodonga, Victoria. Chura's first language is Nepalese. Chura spent 20 years in a notoriously unstable, unhealthy refugee camp. The camp was rife with malnutrition, disease, and violence against women and children. Although there was all these things to contend with, education was among the best services provided within the refugee camps. It was generally better inside than in the surrounding countryside of Nepal. Chura has been living in Australia for 8 years now. He identifies himself as a Bhutanese man. During the interview, Chura talked about the key influences that impacted upon him during his schooling. These 3 key influences were determination, the education program, and the teachers. The primary influence that Chura speaks of in regards to his own schooling is determination. He said, "We arrived with nothing in these refugee camps. All had been lost. The only asset we could think of was education." The Bhutanese people started their first impromptu schools as soon as they arrived in eastern Nepal, and called it the Bhutanese Refugee Education Program. They began teaching in the open air, on the sand, under the trees. Chura started school at 7 a.m. and didn't finish till 7 p.m. at night. He said, "We had a thirst for education." The teachers began rigorous training and were constantly practicing self-evaluation and making adjustments to the curriculum. The program worked incredibly well and has been deemed as possibly one of the best education programs in the world in a refugee camp. On reflection, it made me realise how much I have taken for granted in my life. Education wasn't something I had to fight for or work towards. The Bhutanese people had lost everything, and when their future was so uncertain, education, or the hope for education, was what had kept them going, kept the future alive with possibilities and something to strive for. The second key influence for Chura that impacted upon his schooling was the education program. Chura says, "My life's struggles would have become unbearable if I didn't continue my education." One thing that helped make life more bearable for Chura when he was exiled from his country and helped him to thrive once he was resettled in Wodonga was a high-quality education program. Chura says they learnt 3 languages from the age of 5 onwards. They learnt English medium, they learnt Nepalese, which is their mother tongue, and they learnt Dzongkha, which is their national language. The Bhutanese Refugee Education Program has been evaluated as having the following strengths: a positive attitude towards education on the part of children and youth, families and teachers, strong systems for teacher training and support, and good organisation. On reflection, I can see vast differences in the education program in Australia and the Bhutanese Refugee Education Program. It is not a community approach to education in Australia, but a government approach that is steeped in political agenda. The teachers have very little input into what they teach the students, and into what they believe is important for the students to develop their own identity. The third key influence for Chura that impacted upon his schooling were his teachers. Chura says, "My teachers were the parents of some of my friends. They were Bhutanese people whom I knew and respected. They made a huge impact on my education and schooling." There were 1,200 voluntary teaching staff whom were all Bhutanese refugees. When Chura completed his schooling, he began teaching maths in the refugee camp and later went on to become the principal of one of the schools. On reflection, I don't recall ever having a close personal relationship with any of my teachers. There wasn't the same level of respect that Chura had for his teachers. I showed respect to my teachers by listening and obeying direction, but there wasn't the same level of sincere appreciation or feeling of togetherness. It seems that Chura has a real sense of community, and I believe that wasn't present in my own schooling. We are now going to talk about the theory and research that underpins identity that comes from having cultural diversity. I love this quote by Nelson Mandela. "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. If you talk to a man in his own language, it goes to his heart." The research shows that student populations are becoming increasingly diverse, with varying racial, ethnic, cultural, and socio-economic experiences. However, the pre-service teacher population is becoming more homogenous, primarily Caucasian and middle class. So what does this mean for the students? Well, in Australia, the students historically at risk are those from non-English speaking backgrounds, rural and remote areas, low socioeconomic status backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island backgrounds, as well as students with learning difficulties and disabilities. There is much research in Australia and elsewhere that has pointed to the failure of such students to achieve in relation to their Anglo middle class counterparts. This inequity has largely been attributed to the failure of teachers, which are predominantly the homogenous primary Caucasian and middle class, for those teachers to respond to the needs of these students in culturally sensitive and appropriate ways. We need to look at how we overcome these inequities. Professor George J. Seferdee is a professor in the Department of Humanities. He discusses the importance of using the knowledge of all of our cultures to educate the youth of today. His view on how educators need to cross boundaries is something that is important for all new teachers to grasp, as we cannot allow cultural differences to affect the education of students. Teachers play such a powerful role in young students' lives. We need to take this fact seriously. Many students will lack the courage and drive to push their limits. It is then up to the teacher and the teacher's responsibility to continually encourage their students. In order to reflect on Chura's life and how his identity has been developed as a consequence of his education, I need to reflect on my own social background. I have been very fortunate in my life to have had the freedom to pursue my dreams, and if one dream doesn't work out, to try another. My name is Lauren Murphy. I am aged 28 years old. I identify as a middle-class Caucasian Australian female. I have grown up in Thurgoona, New South Wales, where I attended the local primary school and then the high school in Albury. The high school was a public school in close proximity to a public housing area. This meant there were many students from low socioeconomic families that attended the school. I finished high school when I was 17 years old. I continued on to study environmental science at the local university. I enjoyed the course, which proceeded over 3 years, and was excited to gain my first full-time position on completion of the course as a project officer in Serena, Queensland. While working in this position, I married and decided to start a beautiful family. I have a daughter named Ella, and life changed instantly. Having Ella gave me new strength, and I decided to pursue my passion for social work and began my psychology degree. I currently work with children who are living under child protection orders. I enjoy this position and has helped me to recognise the importance of education as a significant factor in breaking the poverty cycle. At the beginning of this year, I decided to embark on the journey of completing my Masters in Education. I will now look at my cultural background. Well, growing up in regional New South Wales meant there was never a major cultural variation in the school. My parents are both white Australian, and their parents before them were too. So the cultural diversity in our family is fairly non-existent. As I grew up, my parents displayed what we might call a modern level of racism that had been entrenched in them due to their upbringing. I decided for myself from a very early age that this was not a quality nor a behaviour I valued or wanted to hand down to my own children. Through my own experiences, I have put an emphasis on accepting everyone's differences in whatever form they may come. This has had a major effect on who I am and the manner in which I teach the students with a different background to my own. So, how does this influence my teaching? Well, due to the lack of cultural variety while I was growing up, I never really had to deal with any issues that may arise with several varying cultures in a classroom. As I have matured, I look at education very differently. I believe that an educator's role is to not only teach a certain subject to their students, but it is also their role to teach students how they can solve issues and problems that every student faces today. Growing up in a school where many students had very little and came from troubled families, I appreciate that everyone has their own story and their own circumstances they have to deal with. One of the biggest lessons I have learnt throughout my life was that for some students, simply being at school is a huge success. As a teacher, I want to encourage each student to do the best they can do and not compare themselves to anyone else. How does this impact my teaching? Well, as I begin to discover the type of teacher I want to be, I look back at the teachers that I liked. Most of them had new and creative ways to teach their lessons. This is something that is hugely important to every lesson. If I can create lessons that give students a passion for the subject, they will be more likely to take in this information and gain a deeper understanding of the subject. As I have progressed through the cultural plunge and self-reflected, I recognise the importance of using each individual's student knowledge of their culture to educate the youth of today. We need to cross boundaries and ensure that cultural differences do not isolate a student, but make a student feel empowered, make them feel beautifully unique and appreciated. As a teacher, we play a powerful role in our students' lives. I take this fact very seriously, and I am excited to always ensure that I have a culturally inclusive classroom.